Hey everybody, it's Andrew, and in this episode of Engines of Pere Marquette, I'm going to talk about the Consolidations. These have a lot to unpack for a single episode, but without further ado, let's get started. The 280 wheel arrangement was an expansion of the 080 and 260. It had better stability around curves than the 080, and was stronger than the 260. The first locomotive of this wheel arrangement was built in the United States for the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1864, and other railroads would soon follow. Even into the 1910s, a lot of railroad companies, including the Pere Marquette, were still buying or building consolidation types. The Pere Marquette had a grand total of 167 consolidations, built from 1901 to 1911 and divided across 11 different batches. This was the most mass-produced locomotive wheel arrangement ever built for the Pere Marquette. The railroad's predecessor companies never had any consolidations because the light traffic, absence of heavy grades, and rough track conditions of these railroads defeated the need for having consolidations. But after the Pere Marquette's formation, the new railroad began a concerted effort to develop overhead traffic to make a new bridge route between trade centers in the east and midwestern U.S. Connections to the south and east of Michigan caused an increase in coal traffic so massive that the Pere Marquette needed larger freight locomotives to cope with the surge. The idea was that the PM would use those larger freight locomotives on the main lines, while the older and smaller 440s and 260s would handle the branch lines. And so, in 1901, the Pere Marquette ordered 21 consolidations numbered 330 to 350 from their favorite builder, Brooks. The new locomotives were designated as C2s. The first engine to be built, number 344, was displayed at the 1901 Pan American Exposition at Buffalo, decorated with the Pere Marquette's new Trans-Michigan Route logo and Brooks' name on the tender. This made 344 the first Pere Marquette locomotive to gain any fame, way before Berkshire 1225 did, starting in 1957, and eventually being restored in 1988, then later being used for the Polar Express in 2004. From 1903 to 1909, the Pere Marquette ordered 81 more C2s, mostly from what was now Alco's Brooks plant, with the rest being ordered from Baldwin. But the numbering scheme for these locomotives was a mess. The next C2s were a batch of 6 numbered 324 to 329 in 1903, followed by a batch of 10 numbered 314 to 323 in 1904, then another 16 numbered 298 to 213 in March 1905, then after that came 15 Baldwin-built C2s numbered 283 to 297 from March to April 1905, then 10 more numbered 273 to 282, and another 10 numbered 366 to 375, and finally, a batch of 12 numbered 501 to 512 in 1909. Every batch of C2s varied a bit in specifications and looks to some degree, but were nonetheless closely identical, though the 500s were a bit newer and a bit superior in a few aspects. I'm only going to cover the general specs for the C2s by average, rather than individually to cut length on the video, production time, and stress on my vocal cords. Depending on the tender, the C2s weighed an average of 139 tons total and were 60 to 63 feet long. They had an average grade area of 49.3 square feet, a combined heating surface of 2,748 square feet, a tractive effort of over 31,000 pounds, and driving wheels that were 56 inches in diameter on the first batch and 57 inches for the rest. Locomotives 314 to 350 had 20 by 28 inch cylinders, while the rest initially had 19.5 by 26 inch cylinders that were rebored to 20 inches in the 1910s, thus increasing the cylinder size to 20 by 26 inches. 314 to 350 were initially built with piston valves, while the rest were initially built with slide valves, but were later refitted with piston valves by 1920, except for the Baldwin-built locomotives, which never received them. The 1901 C2s had 210 psi boilers, while the rest had 200 psi boilers. As for the tenders, engines 273 to 313 and 366 to 375 were fitted with 12-ton 5,000-gallon tenders, the 500s with 12-ton 6,000-gallon tenders, and the rest with 15-ton 5,500-gallon tenders. The C2s were rated for over 6,800 tons on level track, 2,018 tons on 1.5% grades, and 741 tons on assisted on Richmond Hill, the Pere Marquette's toughest grade. While they could outperform every currently existing Pere Marquette locomotive at the time, they weren't as big and strong as contemporary Consolidations were, something typical of most early Pere Marquette locomotives. They were used in freight service on the Pere Marquette's new main lines, including the one between Chicago and New Buffalo, and connecting Michigan with the eastern and southern US. Several C2s even got to work in Canada, between St. Thomas, Ontario, and Buffalo, New York. This was thanks to the trackage rights granted by the Michigan Central and its parent company, the New York Central. In response to the track pans present on the Michigan Central lines, the C2's tenders were fitted with water scoops. With this massive fleet of Consolidations, the Pere Marquette could finally replace and retire their predecessors' old and beaten locomotives starting in the 1910s in favor of their newer and stronger Consolidations. Meanwhile, back in 1903, the Pere Marquette designed an upgraded version of the C2s known ironically as the C1s, of which they ordered 15, numbered 351 to 365 from Brooks that year, supplementing the C2s. The C1s were 64 feet, 7 3/8 inches long overall, and weighed 150.75 tons total. They had a tractive effort of 37,386 pounds, a grade area of 54.4 square feet, a total heating surface of 2,786 square feet, 57-inch driving wheels, 21 by 26-inch cylinders, 210 psi boilers, piston valves with Stevenson valve gear, and 14-ton, 6,000-gallon tenders. These Consolidations could handle trains weighing up to over 2,000 tons on the main line between Chicago and New Buffalo, and 1,650 tons westbound from Wyoming, Michigan, with pushers out of Waverly Yard at St. Joseph, Michigan. For comparison, the C2s were rated for only 1,800 tons, and the M-class Moguls for only 1,550 tons between Chicago and New Buffalo. Westbound from Wyoming, the C2s were only rated for 1,400 tons, and 1,200 tons for the M's and TC's. The C1s and all of the Brooks-built C2s were later fitted with arch tubes in their fireboxes and superheaters by 1920, which improved their performance. The same would also happen to latter PM Consolidations. From 1910 to 1911, the Pere Marquette designed and ordered 2 batches of 50 bigger and more modern Consolidations from Alco's Richmond and Brooks plants. The first of these were the Class C Consolidations, of which Alco's Richmond plant built 25 in 1910 for the PM, who had them numbered 601 to 625. The Cs, or better known as 600s, were 68 feet long and weighed 180.5 tons total. They had 40,500 pounds of tractive effort, 14-ton 7,000-gallon tenders, 55 square feet of grade area, 2,962 square feet of heating surface, 61-inch driving wheels, piston valves with newer Walschaerts valve gear, 22 by 30-inch cylinders, and 200 psi boilers. The 600s could pull trains weighing up to 2,750 tons from Brown City to Port Huron, Michigan, and used on 2,200-ton trains in the PM Saginaw district where they were initially assigned to. Okay, I'm sure at this point you get the idea that every time the PM got new 280s, they got stronger and better than the last. While definitely an improvement over the C1s in everything including tractive effort, the 600's tractive effort was still a bit on the low side for Consolidations of the time, especially when compared to older examples like Southern 630 and Southern Pacific 2718. At least they could still outmatch the 31,492 pounds of the US Army S-160s. In the latter days of the Pere Marquette, the 600 spent a good portion of their life in the Canadian division. 16 of them were fitted with water scoops, and most of those 16 were also fitted with handrails on the tops of their tenders, as required by Canadian law. They could handle 45-car loaded trains east to Buffalo, and usually brought 100 empty cars back. 8 of them would also become the only Pere Marquette Consolidations to ever have automatic stokers. Then in 1911, the Pere Marquette ordered their final batch of Consolidations, which were also the biggest and possibly most well known of them all, the SCs, which had bigger boilers than the 600s. Alco's Brooks plant built 25 of them, and they were numbered 901 to 925 by the Pere Marquette. This totaled the number of Pere Marquette Consolidations to 165. Regarding technical specifications, not to rip off Amtrak Guy 365, I assume the S would have meant the addition of a superheater, super, or to identify them as bigger than the Cs. The C, as one could probably guess, meant that it was a consolidation type. The SCs, better known as 900s, were 72 feet long overall and weighed 196.25 tons total. They had 50,000 pounds of tractive effort, a grade area of 56.4 square feet, a combined heating surface of almost 3,500 square feet, a superheater, 14-ton, 8,000-gallon tenders, 57-inch driving wheels, 180 psi boilers, piston valves with Walschaerts valve gear, and 25 by 30-inch cylinders. When compared to other 280s in tractive effort, the SCs were among the most powerful consolidations of their time, and quickly became the pride of the Pere Marquette's freight service. They were also the strongest locomotives in the fleet until the arrival of the Pere Marquette's first Mikados in 1913. These consolidations were something to be taken seriously by other railroads, as they weren't like most other early Pere Marquette locomotives, which were a bit smaller and weaker than others of the same time. They were on par with locomotives of their type. The 900s and the SP-class Pacifics were the first Pere Marquette locomotives to use superheaters. They were rated for 3,000 tons between Chicago and New Buffalo, and 2,025 tons east to Grand Rapids. Out of Saginaw, they could handle 2,300 tons to Brown City, and 3,100 tons from there to Port Huron. They even crossed the border from Canada from time to time. The reason for the SC's lower boiler pressure of 180 psi was because it was said that after 11 months of hard service, no flues needed to be repaired. Whereas if having 200 psi boilers would have required them to have their flues replaced every 9 months, and considering that steam locomotives need a lot of care, it makes sense. Pretty remarkable that the SCs could be so powerful for a 1910 era consolidation, even with 180 instead of 200 psi boilers. One of them, number 902, was even used on a 6-day trip that turned into an endurance test. But it's a pretty long story I can talk about in another video, if I ever decide to. Later on in their careers, some of the 900s had thermic siphons installed, which added 66 square feet to their heating surface. They were popular locomotives in all classes of freight service, even into the PM's final years. Their respectable tractive effort and power output of 2,000 horsepower served them well, but their small 57-inch driving wheels, counterbalance issues, and lack of modern appliances limited their capabilities. As a result of this, the larger Mikados, Santa Fe's, and eventually the famous Berkshires were forced to take over the Pere Marquette's fastest and heaviest trains upon their arrival for the unstable, slower, and older 900s. As mentioned previously, the Pere Marquette had 167 280s, but only 165 of them were actual Pere Marquette locomotives. The remaining in question were a pair of 1895 Altoona-built locomotives that were originally built for the Lake Erie and Detroit River Railway as 50 and 51 before joining the Pennsylvania Railroad. They were eventually bought by the Pere Marquette at some point, but I don't know the exact year, and it might be unknown elsewhere. What I do know, thanks to the book I got this information from, is that they were renumbered to 819 and 820 respectively by the Pere Marquette, and eventually scrapped in 1917. As was the case with any other Pere Marquette locomotive, all of the PM Consolidations were later rebuilt to look more modern. This included moving the headlights to the center of the smokebox door, applying newer number and letter fonts, adding cylinder pipes to some, and fitting superheaters to the older C1s, C2s, and 600s. While normally used on freight trains, as was the case with any consolidation in North America, a handful of photographs show that the Pere Marquette Consolidations were occasionally used on passenger trains. Out of them, the 600s were best suited to this thanks to having the largest driving wheels at 61 inches. They even had their tenders built up a bit in response to this. By 1945, the number of 280s on the PM's roster had dropped to 163 due to a pair of C2s being sold off. C2 number 325 was sold to the Manistee and Northeastern Railway on October 9, 1933, and locomotive 303 was sold to the Canada and Dominion Sugar Company at Wallaceburg, Ontario on December 11, 1945. Both locomotives spent the rest of their careers with their new respective company, being repainted but retained their Pere Marquette numbers. The remaining Consolidations served as the backbone of the Pere Marquette's freight service for up to more than 20 years, and even when larger locomotives came into the picture, the railroad still kept their Consolidations in service on lighter trains. And finally, the Consolidations were the oldest Pere Marquette steam locomotives to survive into the Chesapeake and Ohio merger. The Consolidations did survive into the C&O merger, right? Well, similar to the 27 Pacifics, only some 280s did. All of the C1s were scrapped from 1926 to 1945. C2 number 302 and all of the 500s entered service on the C&O, while the remaining C2s were scrapped before they could join the C&O roster, with their scrapping taking place between 1931 and 1948. Even though all of the 500s survived into the Chesapeake and Ohio merger, only 4 of them, numbers 501, 502, 504, and 507 were ever added to the roster, as the rest of the 500s were retired and scrapped before they could join, in December 1947. The Chesapeake and Ohio planned to renumber the 302 to 715, but the locomotive was likely retired before they could do so, and scrapped in 1948. The 500s still in service were to be renumbered to 720 to 723, but were never done so because they were retired before they could be repainted. The entire 600 or C-class survived into the merger and were renumbered to 750 to 774 and entered the Chesapeake and Ohio roster as the Class G2. But only 20 of the 600s were ever renumbered thanks to a stipulation in the merger agreement requiring that any equipment still not fully paid for had to retain its Pere Marquette lettering and road number. The 900s entered the C&O roster, ironically for some reason as the Class G1, and were to be renumbered to 725 through 749 by the Chesapeake and Ohio, but only 7 of them were renumbered thanks to that stipulation. With the locomotives reaching 40 years old and the rise of diesel power, they didn't last much longer. The Chesapeake and Ohio began scrapping their ex-Pere Marquette Consolidations in 1947, and they were all cut up by 1951, with none to spare for preservation. Pere Marquette 622, aka Chesapeake and Ohio 771, was the last to go. Even the pair of sold-off C2s were not spared for preservation, being scrapped after being retired presumably in the 1950s. The Consolidations served as the railroad's backbone for almost 20 years, and up to over 40 by the time of their demise. They weren't glamorous nor fast locomotives, but they were durable. They were an important part of the locomotive equation, and will always be remembered in the history book of the Pere Marquette Railroad, the railroad that gave us 1225, the real Polar Express. Hey guys, Real Life Me here. The information used to make this video was interpreted through Thomas Dixon Jr. and Art Millen's Pere Marquette Power. This book contains dozens, if not hundreds of photographs of Pere Marquette railroading that you may otherwise never find on Google Images. Or anywhere else on the internet for that matter. I know the last couple of uploads has been mostly focused in this series and not too much on other things. This is because I want to get the Berkshire build-up finished in time for December by finishing the Mikado and Santa Fe episodes so I can finally move on to the Berkshires. So, yeah. Oh, and not to mention, production of this video was supposed to start a week earlier than it did, but unfortunately the passing of my grandmother and her funeral and an upcoming test got in the way, so I was held back from doing that. Not emotionally, but just by the test, and, well, you get the idea. Well guys, if you enjoyed the video or learned something new, drop a like on the video and subscribe to my channel to see more railroad related content like this. And if you're already subscribed, be sure to activate notifications so that you won't miss any future upload, including the next episode where I will talk about the Mikados, and the episode after that where I will be talking about the Santa Fe's. I appreciate the feedback you've given me on the first episode that has helped me improve the second episodes and onwards, and the positive reception that episodes 2 and onwards have been getting from you, my viewers. Thank you. I'm Andrew Raila, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.